Hello, my name is Al-Greene, and I'm here today to discuss the Civil War in Ukraine, its history, the ongoing conflict, uh, and where I think it might end up going. Through the course of this presentation, I'll discuss the overall history of the region, of the world, between Russia and Ukraine, both, like I said, more recent history, but as well as history looking further back. And I hope to provide some level of competent analysis to some of this discussion. It's a major story of today, and when this video is being created in 2022, but this story goes back to 2014, 2008, and even really further back. So without too much more, I want to dive right into this presentation on the Ukrainian Civil War. So I'm going to approach this presentation through three academic prongs. Um, I'm going to look at the conflict onset, the conflict dynamics, and an application of academic theory and an international relations context to this conflict, and where there might be points of disagreement. The first aspect we will examine is the conflict onset, what led to the current realities on the ground, the history, the geopolitical considerations, and the dynamics that exist between and among the different actors in Ukraine and Russia, as well as other outside powers. So before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there is already a conflict brewing. Some people would call it a civil war. Some would call it a separatist action. Others would call it a thinly veiled invasion attempt by either Russia or, depending on who you ask, the United States and its allies. But from my perspective, I'm examining this conflict as a civil war, and I think it fits many of the definitions of what makes for a civil war. It's you have outside and inside factors vying for geopolitical control and separation of a state, and but to really get the picture of how we got to this place to make these determinations, we need to go a little further back, and I'm going to, like I said, examine this from the breakup of the Soviet Union, World War II, and the resulting Cold War years, and even further back into the more ancient history. Ukraine is a nation on the crossroads of several different powers and cultural geographic regions and peoples, and as a result, it's played an outsized role in its history for being in the thick of things. I want to go all the way back to the Russian Empire and Catherine the Great as a foundation to speak about Ukraine today. Catherine the Great was married to Peter III, who was the grandson of Peter the Great, and she would go on to rule in her own right. And during the latter parts of the 18th century, when particularly focused on Crimea, where it was the land was ruled by people of Turkish descent. In a series of military actions, the Russian Empire took control of the Korean Peninsula, and later was able to take the rest of modern-day Ukraine into the Russian Empire. And by 1783, this annexation was of Crimea was complete. She had defeated the Muslim population and displaced them with eventually what would be the descendants of the people who live there now, or of Russian ancestry, rather than the people who lived there prior. As we move into the more recent history, we will look at the region known as the Pale of Settlement. Now, during the Russian Empire, the empire's Jewish population was confined by law to an area that includes not only present-day Ukraine, but also other nations such as Lithuania. And during this period, millions of people lived in this region. Millions of Ukrainian Jews lived in this region for many, many generations. But as anti-Semitism grew and grew more violent, and then as we enter the Second World War, the Ukrainian Jewish population was decimated, and the people who survived the Holocaust, many of them would go on to move to other nations, chiefly Israel. Many moved to America. But when you look today, the Jewish population in Ukraine is very small compared to what it was previously. And this is relevant because one of the current accusations leveled against the pro-Western aspect of the Ukrainian government is that they are, at the very least, overly friendly with Nazi elements within the country. So given the history of anti-Semitism and the murder of its Jewish population in recent centuries, it's apparent why these charges are so emotionally powerful and persuasive to many people. So as we move into World War II and the importance of particularly the Donbass region to the war effort. Previously, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact, meaning that they had decided that they would not fight each other and declare neutrality towards each other. However, Hitler would break this non-aggression pact and launch an offensive into the Soviet Union in 1941. This was Operation Barbarossa. One of the places that he was targeting particularly was the east of Ukraine, the Donbass region. It was a major industrial hub, had factory production, and because of its proximity and access to raw materials, it was a very economically and strategic position that he hoped to take. The Operation Barbarossa was ultimately unsuccessful. The Russian winter proved to be too great of a force to overcome. But that did not stop hundreds of thousands of Russian troops and an unknown number of civilians from being killed, and many of these who were killed, both civilians and troops, were Ukrainian. And again, this threat of Nazism and this very emotionally charged issue, and there are still people alive from that period today, and so when you bring up talks of Nazis in Ukraine, that becomes a very powerful talking point. And so the people who level it are doing so deliberately and know of its the potency of the talking point, and that the rhetoric will bring to the conversation and to perceptions of many people. And as you can see on this map, the Moscow and Leningrad, though, were the major targets ultimately of the attempt to conquer the Soviet Union. The Leningrad and Stalingrad, the advance from Germany into through Operation Barbarossa is not possible without traveling through Ukraine. So comes 1991 and the eventual breakup of the Soviet Union. From here we have a bit of uncertainty. The people of Ukraine overwhelmingly vote for their own independence, but at the time, a substantial part of the Soviet population lived in the borders of Ukraine. There were many nuclear weapons in the Ukrainian border. The Ukrainian agricultural system produced a substantial amount of the wheat for that part of the world, and therefore it's not without consideration why it was a bit of a turbulent time. Ultimately, a decision was made that the nuclear weapons would be taken out of Ukraine and that their borders would be guaranteed and protected as a bargain. And this brings us to the more modern era. And in 2008, then President George W. Bush made a declaration that he supported the right of both Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. Now, this would have marked a major expansion of the NATO organization, which, as we know, was formed after World War II as a way to fight and deter, rather, the expansion of Soviet power. And now to have nations that were part of the larger Soviet empire, former Soviet republics joining NATO, was something that, to many in Russia, particularly Putin, would be quite unacceptable. So, following these remarks and actions by the Georgian government, the Russians would launch a 5-day invasion into Georgia after a breakaway region of the country, South Ossetia, took action to navigate away from the Georgian government towards the Russian government. And in many ways, this goes to foreshadow the current conflict, and because there are somewhat similar dynamics. So next we have in 2014 and 2013, the then president of Ukraine rejected a measure that would have led to greater integration of the Ukrainian economy with the European Union's economy. And because of this, his refusal to agree to this, he was ousted by the people of Kiev in what would be known as the really probably the true beginning of this current conflict was the ouster of the Yanushchenkov administration. And at the same time, we also start to look at what's going at the same time going on in Crimea, because that plays a major role in what would go on to happen. So Crimea is a peninsula that lies on the Black Sea. It is one of the few warm water ports in the Russian sphere of influence. The Russians have one of their major naval fleets on the peninsula, and so at the same time that the government of in Kiev was being ousted in 2014, in Crimea, the Russians were supporting a referendum both by political advisors and by troops, and something upwards of 90% of the people of Crimea voted for leaving their current status within the Ukrainian government and for a autonomous status. And many in the Russian side would argue that the people in Crimea were culturally and historically Russian, as we spoke earlier. Catherine the Great and in her conquest against the Turks that lived in the peninsula, they were supplanted by the ancestors of the people who live there today. But many people also question the validity of this referendum, particularly because of the presence of Russian troops. But since 2014, the Crimean Peninsula has left the increasingly pro-Western Ukrainian geopolitical family and has become a closer ally to the Russian side. But at the same time this was happening, we have in Donetsk and Luhansk, this is the Donbas region. At the same time, we have these autonomous movements in Crimea. We have the separatists rising up in the Donbas. So next we can talk about the conflict dynamics. So as this civil war was raging, beginning to rage, between the people who live in Donbas, that's Eastern Ukraine, the pro-Russian faction, against the pro-Russian faction, against the pro-Western faction in Ukraine. Their fighting breaks out in earnest, and the death toll begins to rise. But what really brings about the attention of the outside world is in July of 2014, a passenger plane is shot down on its way from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur on the border between Ukraine and Russia, killing everyone on board. And for a while there's concern, was it terrorist, mechanical issues, what could have happened. It was later determined that it was more than likely Russian separatists who had shot down the plane, thinking it was a military asset. And that's really when the attention of the Western world came to the Ukrainian Civil War. So early on, the separatists seemed to be at a disadvantage. The other side had the support of the central government, which naturally would mean more resources and more troops and ammunition. But the Russians, from a pretty early perspective, seemed to have been lending material support to the separatists. There were 40,000 troops massed on the border. There were skirmishes. And there were reports that some of the separatist fighters in the east were actually just Russian troops in disguise. So since the beginning of the Civil War, there have been 14,000, some say 15,000 casualties among the Ukrainians, both military and civilians. And there have been lulls in the fighting, but for the most part, there's at least been a stream of violence continuing throughout the period, though there have been attempts to negotiate settlements. The Helsinki Accords, for example, were an attempt to try to come to some sort of a ceasefire agreement, but they, as we know today, did not ultimately hold. So how are the separatists and their movement, how are they surviving? Well, as I said, they've been lent material support from Russia, and many, as I said, have accused many within the separatist ranks of simply being Russian soldiers disguised as Ukrainian separatists. One example that's mentioned by observers to this is a former Russian military officer, Strelkov Gherkin, was taking part as a commander on the separatist side, and he had an extensive background within the Russian security services, and his presence seems to lend credibility to the idea that the Russians were directly aiding the separatists, though for much of this time claimed that they were not. And finally, it's time I'd like to look at the application of the academic theory and the international relations context to this conflict. So my main theory, which I observe, is the idea of conflict management and its implications for the causes of war. Now, when in a civil war or any other action really, the desire for resources and economic power is a strong motivation. As we said, the Donbass region is a very resource and industrial heavy area, and it's strategically important as it borders Russia. But in some instances, the desire to obtain valuable resources may fuel the likelihood of conflict and civil war, and I think this is the case here. De Rohan, in his research, presents the idea that a state can avoid resource-related conflict, but there has to be some sort of a framework to discourage this sort of, we could almost say, plundering. If it appears that all someone has to do is come in with machinery and troops, and you can have access to the oil or the minerals, or it makes a very attractive target. So creating infrastructure to discourage readily access by invasion is how you prevent internal and external actors from coming in and trying to seize your own assets. And in the case of the ongoing civil war in Ukraine, between the pro-Western factions and the pro-Russian factions, the economic lore of the Donbass region is great. In Ukraine, the traditional source of economic power was farming. It's a major producer of wheat for example, between Russia and Ukraine, they produce a substantial percentage of the world's wheat. The eastern part of the country, like I said, in the decades immediately prior to World War II, it became a major industrial center, and as a in the portfolio of the Ukrainian economy as a rather valuable, uh, an attractive commodity. So which side would be better situated? Well, according to one researcher, Professor Connolly, the eastern part of the country, because of its industrialization, is probably ultimately better off. If there was to be a split between the East and the West, while the West does have access to more resources in terms of its relationship to the United States and the European Union, the East does have its relationships with Russia and access to its industrial core, and they, at least according to Connolly, would be in a good position to become an economically independent region. So, like I said, if things did split, the Donbass region would be an economically powerful area, and also because of the number of people who have been killed and resources and infrastructure destroyed, it seems even less likely that the Ukrainians would wish to let the region go quite so easily, even as an attempt to sue for peace. So in closing, I think we do have a bit more that we'll see of this conflict, and as we go on, there's a bit of a muddying between what exactly is conflict relating to the Civil War and what is conflict relating to the current invasion, and some things are a little bit of both. But only time will tell, and only time will tell what ultimate resolution we come to, whether or not a unified country or a splitting up into multiple regions. Thank you.